Okay, I'm going to go ahead and have a start because I don't think the fire marshal will let any more people in here anyway. And so good afternoon and welcome to the first event in the 2009-2010 State of Democracy Lecture Series. All of us in this room owe a big debt of gratitude to the Maxwell Dean's Office for its ongoing support of the series. I'd like to thank them. And I'm also grateful to the Campbell Institute, its director, Mike Westlenko, and its staff, Bethany Wallawender and Kelly Coleman, for their very, very intense dedication to our series. I'd like to ask you to please be sure to mark your calendars for November 19th, when we will welcome Leonard Berman, who's the Daniel Patrick Moynihan Chair in Public Affairs, newly appointed, for a discussion about healthcare and policy. And in the spring, stay tuned for Laura Nader. Laura Nader's coming, like all card-carrying members of the Nader clan. She will be bringing her provocative ideas and rhetoric to our podium. So please attend those. I'd like to also note that this year, for the first time, we'll be making our lectures available on iTunes. And so you should be sure to come to all the talks and ask questions, and then you can download yourself and watch yourself over and over again. So you can relive your moment in the sun. As is our usual practice, today's talk will run for about 40 minutes, and the lecture will be followed by a brief commentary, around 10 minutes, and upon conclusion, we will open up the floor to your questions. Please observe those time-honored rules that you all learned, I think, in kindergarten, phrasing your questions efficiently and in the form of actual questions when you ask them. So, our featured speaker for today is Claudia Goldin. She is the Henry Lee Professor of Economics at Harvard University. She completed her BA not far away from where we are now at Cornell University and her PhD at the University of Chicago. Professor Goldin is a fellow at the National Academy of Sciences and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and her research has been funded by the NSF and the Spencer Foundation, and she was also a Guggenheim Fellow in 1987 and 88. Among the books she has authored and co-authored are Understanding the Gender Gap, An Economic History of American Women, The Regulated Economy, A Historical Approach to Political Economy, The Defining Moment, The Great Depression, and the American Economy in the 20th Century, and Corruption and Reform, Lessons from America's Economic History. Claudia Goldin describes her work as interpreting the present through the lens of the past. And her research is characterized by a rare convergence of creativity and attention to detail. She brings to her economic analyses the scholarly independence of a thoughtful contrarian, a dazzling array of data, and the voice of a truly public intellectual. She has the remarkable abilities to see our shared scholarly terrain from angles others have not explored, and this has led her to produce truly path-breaking work on topics as diverse as urban slavery, gendered occupational segregation, and women's surnames after marriage. Woven into her scholarly agenda is a long-standing commitment to analyzing the state of her own profession with particular attention to the trajectory of women in the discipline. Today, she will bring this roster of skills to bear on the topic of education, human capital, and technology in the United States. Following Professor Goldin's talk, we will hear comments from Dr. Thomas Kniesner. Thomas Kniesner is the Krischer Professor of Economics and a Senior Research Associate at the Center for Policy Research at the Maxwell School of Syracuse University. He received his PhD in economics from the Ohio State University. Dr. Kniesner's specialty is the econometric examination of labor and health economic issues, and he is the author of, and co-author of numerous articles on the topic of labor supply, workplace safety, and healthcare costs and use. Among his book publications are Labor Economics, Theory, Evidence, and Policy, Simulating Workplace Safety, The Law and Economics of Workers' Compensation Insurance, and the Effects of Recent Tax Reforms on Labor Supply. Before coming to Syracuse University, Dr. Kniesner was on the faculty of Indiana University's Department of Economics, the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill's Department of Economics, and Duke University's Institute for Policy Studies. He's also served as the senior labor economist on the staff of President Reagan's Council of Economic Advisors and has been a visiting fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution and University College London. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing both Dr. Goldin and Kneesner speak, so please join me now in welcoming Claudia Goldin to Maxwell School.
So my talk today concerns a book that Larry Katz and I published last year, The Race Between Education and Technology. And I'm going to make 3 points in my talk. The first is that around 1980, wage inequality and educational wage differentials began to expand. And these changes have been large and they've been pervasive. They exist even within education, sex, industry, and occupation groupings. Now, this first point is the least controversial of the 3 and the most widely known. I don't mean to say that any of these points is controversial, but the first one is clearly the best known. The second point is not well known, or at least wasn't well known until we published our book. And it is that wage inequality and educational wage differentials didn't expand for the entire 20th century. In fact, wage inequality and educational wage differentials actually decreased from around 1910 to the 1950s, then remained, relatively stable until around 1980. Thus, wage inequality in the 20th century is actually a tale in 2 parts. There is decreasing inequality, then relatively stable, and then increasing. So those 2 parts, decreasing and then increasing. Now, the third point that I'm going to make in developing this argument is perhaps the most novel of the 3. And it is that a unified theory can be developed and empirically demonstrated to explain the large changes in wage inequality in the 20th century. That is, to explain both the decrease and then the stability and then the increase, not an explanation for one part and a different explanation for another part. The same structure, the same framework can encompass everything. Now, the theory involves skill-biased technological change, which increases the relative demand for education and skill, and also changes in educational attainment, which change the relative supply of skill among workforce participants. Now, the really novel finding is not just that you can use the same framework for both sides of this story, but the more novel finding is that it was educational changes and not acceleration in skill-biased technological change that led to the large decrease and then the large increase in wage inequality across the 20th century. That is to say that although skill-biased technological change is extremely important in this story, there's no question there wouldn't be a story without it. Really what's wagging this inequality over the 20th century is really the educational portion of the story. Now, there are other players in this, and what I just did was simplify it. There are other players, to be sure, and we call our framework a demand-supply institutional framework. And the rise and decline of unions in America certainly plays a supporting role in the story, but it is not a major player. And immigration as well plays a contributing role in the story, but it is definitely not playing a starring role. Okay. So the first point is that concerns inequality and economic growth. Now, the American economy grew rapidly in the quarter century after World War II. Per capita incomes rose, and they rose for those at the bottom of the income distribution, and they rose for those at the top. We can rightly say that from 1947 to 1973, America grew together, and these are quintiles for the family income distribution. I'm later going to switch entirely to discussing the wage structure and away from family income. Okay? And you can see that these blue bars, number one, are relatively high. You'll see just how high they are. And the second one is that they look a little bit different from the bottom to the top, but not that much different. And in fact, at the very top, they're the lowest. And this is the growth in average annual growth in percent for these quintiles. When we add the period from 1973 to 2004, we can see that during the subsequent 3 decades, America grew really widely apart. And here we can see what we're more used to hearing about, which is that the top is growing a lot faster than the bottom. But in addition, note that all of the bars are lower, that America just grew more slowly during these years than it grew in the previous period. The other point, taking the same measure of family income, is that if we want to know when did the widening actually occur, in the previous slide you couldn't see exactly when the widening occurred. Now I have here higher frequency data, annual data, and I have individual families at the 20th percentile, the 50th, and the 95th percentile. And you can see that they're basically growing together up until 1980. And then they grow rather widely apart. Now, we care about widening inequality for lots of different reasons. It can adversely affect individuals. We care about differences across individuals. We care about differences in skills. But in a talk that has the title, the general title, the theme of this one, I should also say that widening inequality may also affect the polity, and it may also affect society, as people of different incomes live in different neighborhoods, send their children to different schools, shop in different places, although God knows everyone shops on the internet, so we all shop in the same place, I guess. We just don't see anybody. And also, it can affect the polity as individuals in different parts of the income distribution can have radically different political agendas. Now, many reasons have been offered for rising inequality. These include skill-biased technological change, that in fact there has been, the claim is that there has been a change in the rate of change, that is, there was an acceleration, some people believe. Another possibility is increased immigration and outsourcing, lowering the bottom relative to the top. There's also the relative decline of unions in America. And finally, there's the spread of a winner-take-all economy, as we know exists for rock stars, athletes, CEOs, and even some professors, I understand. Okay. Not in my institution, which believes in horizontal equity, or at least no growth at all for anybody. I guess that's a new form of horizontal equity. Okay. Now, it's going to be important in understanding changes in inequality to recognize that wage inequality changes in wage inequality, is largely due to differences across individuals in the level and type of education, and that increases in the economic returns to education account for about 60% of the rise in wage inequality from the 1970s on. Now, that comes from different calculations that Larry and I have made, that Tom Lemieux and others have made. One can see in this graph, which has two lines, one, the pink one for the 90-10 log wage differential for men, and the blue one, which is the college-high school log wage differential graphed on different axes. You can see that with the exception of what Richard Freeman had called the overeducated American portion, with the exception of this up and down, these two lines sort of go together. This doesn't give us the 60% number, but it shows us that there does appear to be, at first glance and when you scratch the surface, a close relationship between educational wage differentials and the actual wage differentials. Thus, in recent decades, the lion's share of rising inequality can be traced to an increase in educational wage differentials. And this is going to be important in what I'm going to tell you, because for much of the early part of the 20th century, I'm only going to present educational wage differentials. Okay. Now, my second point concerns the long term. The question is, did inequality increase earlier in U.S. history? We see that it increased of late, but what happened earlier? Was it increasing from the early part of the 20th century? So I now turn to long-term inequality trends, because knowing what happened in the more distant past, we'll see, will help us understand why inequality has soared more recently. Now, in asking this question, one is immediately stymied, because the federal census asked income and education beginning only with 1940. This is true not just for the U.S., it's true for almost all other countries. There was less of an interest before the Great Depression in many different economic and social indicators. So other evidence must be found for prior inequality trends, and that's where the historian comes in and the person who searches in archives. So Larry and I have pieced together the full century of inequality using various sources, including what was until recently a relatively obscure state census for 1915 that is so detailed that no federal census has ever come close to the information it includes, and that is the Iowa State Census of 1915. States did censuses prior to 1940, in fact, prior to the 30s when they were too impoverished to do anything. But they did censuses generally in between the decennial census of the federal census. So they would do them on the 5th year. And in general, they included very little information because, after all, they were doing them to seat their house. So they just had to know how many people were around, their age, etc. But for interesting reasons, Iowa did a set of state censuses, one in 1905, 15, and 1925, that have a lot of rich information. Now, most people don't think of the state of Iowa except once every 4 years, you see. And you can recognize some of the people in this picture, at least two of them you might say, who the hell are those? But these were our candidates at the time. Okay. Now, take them out. The Iowa State Census includes information on occupation, for example, months unemployed, total earnings from the occupation, and also the extent of education. And the extent of education that they list, that they asked for is far more complete than anything that the federal census has ever asked for, because it's asking for education by type of school. So it acknowledges that there's a potential difference between going to common school for 12 years and going to a graded school, which would have been a grammar school, for 8 years, and then a graded school, like a high school, for 4 years. Okay, so this is an extremely rich document, and it also has a piece of information that a federal census will never ask, and that is church affiliation. Okay. So we collected a large sample from the Iowa State Census, and we asked the question, what were the returns to education earlier, what was inequality, and then we made the Iowa State Census. We sort of nationalized Iowa. Now, some of you in this room probably don't understand that you can nationalize Iowa, that Iowa was not as different from the rest of America as you think. In fact, in 1915, most of you think that Iowa, admitted, was filled with people who were just farmers. In fact, if you count in the urban population of Iowa, those living in towns, incorporated towns, even if they were smaller than 2,500, the fraction of the population in Iowa that was urban was identical to that in the entire United States. So in fact, Iowa is the perfect example of the United States in 1915. Okay, and so by magically nationalizing Iowa, we can see that rather than rising throughout the century, the returns to education and the premium to skill actually decreased before 1950, in fact, at several moments. And we have lots of other data on occupational skill differentials and on manufacturing occupations that reinforces this. So this isn't just two different data points or one different data point. This is lots of different data points. Okay. Now, the returns, as you can see in this previous graph, the returns to high school and the returns to college in the Iowa data, nationalized Iowa data, are relatively high. In fact, they're so high that we have only recently come back in terms of the college graduate wage premium to where it had been in 1915. Okay. And we can see that in standard Mincer equations, that is, earnings equations, where we have high school in years here, and you can see the returns to high school are relatively high, and they're high even within blue-collar occupations. So you're you're in a blue-collar occupation, and you have a high school education, you're more likely to be in the high-tech trades of your age, which is you're an electrician, okay? You're a plumber. But it's also high among farmers. And the same is true for the college premium. Now, let me recap. Thus far, that I've shown you that there was rapidly rising inequality in wages from 1980 to the present, but rapidly declining wage inequality and educational wage differentials before 1950. So the question is, can we find a single unified theory of inequality for the full 20th century? As I said, not just fit a theory for the first part and then fit a theory for the second part. Maybe computers did do it, as people have claimed. Maybe skill-biased technological change really greatly accelerated in the past several decades. But the problem with that is several-fold. We spend an entire chapter on this in the book. Technological change at the start of the 20th century was just as rapid and skill-biased as it was during much of the remaining century. A machine revolution in the office preceded computers. Electricity revolutionized the factory and the office and the home. The radio, the automobile, and the airplane took off. Factories were transformed by continuous production machinery, and more educated workers were in great demand in clerical work, managerial positions, and even, yes, in blue-collar jobs. In the early 20th century, employers wrote that they wanted operatives that were familiar with algebra, blueprints, chemistry, and electricity. Not all operatives, but certain skilled operatives. Skill-biased technological change is not a new thing, and it did not greatly accelerate in the latter part of the 20th century. Well, if computers didn't do it, wouldn't it be nice if we could just say computers did it, and be done with it? So if computers didn't do it, then what can account for the fact that the 20th century contains these two diverse inequality tales? And thus I get to the race. Now, the title of the book and the talk are taken from a remark by the first Nobel laureate in economics who shared the Nobel Prize that first year, and that's Jan Tinbergen. And Tinbergen said that inequality is the outcome of a race between education and technology. When I should begin first with when technology races ahead of education, inequality generally rises. And the reason I have to say that is that I have these funny pictures. And this is the one with technology racing ahead. Okay? Don't think you can make any sense of this. You can watch it forever. They do the same thing over and over and over again. But you don't have to watch it forever because I have the other half. So this is technology racing ahead of education. Inequality generally rises, but when education speeds up, inequality often declines. Okay. So why didn't inequality increase for the first 3/4 of the 20th century? Technology, as I said, was racing ahead. The relative demand for skill was increasing. Just because it's not necessarily accelerating doesn't mean it isn't increasing. It's still increasing. Okay? And the answer to the question that I just posed is the part 2 of our book, which is contained in the extraordinary history of education in America. Years of education increased rapidly and continuously for cohorts born from 1975 to 1950. And this is our best estimates of years of schooling by birth cohort. And remember, when you look at this, that the horizontal axis is years of birth, not the contemporaneous year, okay? And one little point that's not part of my talk, but is part of the other work that I do, is that prior to birth cohorts of the 20s, and the birth cohorts of the 20s, as many of you know, are the, go back over here, the birth cohorts of the 20s are the men who were disproportionately drafted, volunteered, and served in World War II. But prior to that, note that women have higher educational attainment than men in every year. In fact, we're going to move in a second to the high school movement. During the period of the high school movement from 1910 to 1940, and even before 1910, in every state of the nation, and I checked the data for every state, women, females graduated from high school at higher rates than males did, okay? So today we sort of we're having this conversation at lunch, we sort of scratch our heads and say, look at how many women are in college. Here at Syracuse, it's just like the national average, about 56, 57% of the incoming class is female, okay? And people think, wow, this is so different. What is going on? It isn't different. What was different was the period in between. So, in fact, much of American history looks like women are more educated than men. But that's a whole other thing. Okay. So, now America was the world's leader in mass or universal education in the first half of the 20th century, beginning with the grand high school movement from 1910 to 1940 and continuing with the transition to what was hoped to be mass college education, which is an unfinished transformation. No other nation in the world had as complete a shift to mass secondary school education before 1940. And this is, for the U.S., the graduation rate, and this is contemporaneous. This is contemporaneous data here. For the graduation rate is the number of graduates over the number of 18-year-olds, and the enrollment rate is for those who are enrolled over those in a 4-year period. And you can see the enormous gains that were made in the U.S. in a period that was known then and today as the period of the high school movement. The increase in educated Americans was so large that the relative supply of educated workers outran demand and continued to do so until fairly recently. And we can see that here as well in the graph that I showed you before about years of schooling. But then something happened after 1970. And I gave you a slight preview of this a minute ago accidentally. And you can see that there was a sharp slowdown in educational attainment after the birth cohorts of the late 1940s. You can also see this other thing, which is that, and now women are once again have higher educational attainment than men. And there's that brief period with birth cohorts from like the 1930s to the 1950s. That's a 20-year period. Everything else is women have higher levels of education. Okay. And we can also see this in the high school figure. And so this is the high school graduation rate that I showed you before, the high school, the public and private secondary school graduation rate, rising very rapidly in the period of the high school movement, then falling during World War II, and then continuing its expansion. And then what happens afterwards is this incredible stability, if not collapse, and then sort of a reversion. But for the past 35 years, we have not seen much of an increase in the high school graduation rate. And this is true even if you include the GED recipients. Now, what may be going through your mind is, well, we've reached the limit. I mean, how much higher can you get? Well, if you want to know how much higher you can get, just look at the countries, the other nations in the OECD. They are comparable nations to ours. There's really no reason inherently why our people should be any different from their people. After all, our people, by and large, came from those countries. So they shouldn't be any different. There's something that we're doing wrong, okay? Now, the slowdown can also be seen in the ratio of college to high school equivalent workers across the 20th century, and it's these data that I'm going to be using in the regression, so I thought that I would present these. Now, this construction here takes up about, 3 Larry Katz pages of footnotes, okay? So I can't give you the whole thing, but let us just say that equivalence here is because a 45-year-old high school graduate is different from a 19-year-old high school graduate, and so this massages them in a regression framework, essentially. So just think of it as college educated workers, and by college, it's college graduate plus half of those who attended some college, plus high school graduate workers, and that's high school graduates plus the other half of the college. And what you can see is that across this long period, since this is drawn on a log scale, the slope is the rate of increase. You can see that the rate of increase in the early period was about 3% average annually, and then it was 3.8%. But in the period since around 1980, it has really slowed down. Each of the graphs that I've showed you on education shows a distinct slowing down in the rate at which we're producing educated citizens and workers in the period since around 1970. Okay. Now, in the remainder of my time, I'm going to demonstrate that this slowdown in educational attainment was largely responsible for the increase in the returns to education and much of rising inequality in the post-1980s. Now, similarly, a large increase in educational attainment from 1900 to the 1970s, which is what we're seeing here, was largely responsible for the decrease in the return to education and the reduction of inequality in the previous period. So the 20th century's two inequality tales are largely the result of changes in the supply of educated workers rather than changes in the demand. Okay. Once again, I'm not taking demand out of the picture. I don't believe that you can have a scissors with only one blade. So all I'm saying is that it's not doing the heavy lifting in terms of these changes. Now, because a more educated person today is different from a more educated person in the past, in the book we consider both the premium to college and to high school graduation. In the interest of time, here I'm only going to present the first dichotomy, which is the college, non-college. And thus, what we would like to explain is this. So this is the college wage premium from 1915 to 2005 with high frequency after the 60s and somewhat lower frequency before. Okay. And what we're going to do is we build a very simple model of production in which you produce with skilled labor and unskilled labor, and skilled labor and unskilled labor are substitutable here, and we have a way of building into these lambdas and these thetas the degree of skill-biased technological change. Okay, so skilled labor, unskilled labor, depending upon what the relative demand is, you're going to move into, depending upon what the technological shift is, you're going to move into one or the other. Okay, so these are the estimating equations that come out of a production model, and today we're going to only look at the first one, and the second one is in the book. And we're going to estimate equation 1 over the years for which we have educational returns and education supply data. We include time trends to capture the increased relative demand for educated workers. We include various breaks, particularly break after 1949, and also in the 1990s. Okay, so if you want to know more about the model, you can look at the book, but what we do is we estimate that, and then we are going to see so these are the actual values for the college wage premium. Now I'm going to show you the predicted values for this based on our estimation. So we are assuming here that we can take this supply as exogenous and get out estimates for the elasticity of substitution, which I will use in a moment. But right now the question is, what do the predicted values look like? And can you possibly explain a decrease and then an increase? And the answer is, these are the predicted values. And you do extraordinarily well with a very simple model. And the simple model is, and I'll show it to you in graphical form in a moment, the simple model is that you have skill-biased technological change that's moving at a relatively constant rate over time with this time trend that I just told you about, okay? But you have supply that's moving around at this discontinuous rate, which I just showed you before, okay? Now you can see here that there are two periods that don't fit as well, and it would be surprising if we could fit everything. And the two periods are those in which we then pull out sort of we call it the SDI model, the supply-demand institutions. And one period that doesn't fit is the 1940s. And the 1940s were filled with all sorts of institutions, such as wage setting and social norms of not, having the top part of the wage structure expanding too much. And if we put in a dummy variable for 1949, this sort of anchors 1949 further down and makes it fit somewhat better. The other period that doesn't fit is this over here, which was a period in which unions had much better control of their wages after the enormous inflation of the 1970s. Okay, the point quite simply is that we can explain a lot with a very sparse setup. But you might wonder what part of the changes was supply and what part of the changes were demand. And the big changes, as I said, up and down in the returns to education were due to shifts in the supply. So let me show you how you can think about that. So go back to a simple supply-demand world in which, rather than the horizontal axis being a quantity, this is a relative quantity, which is the change over time. Okay, so this is a supply-demand framework in rate of change form. And so on the vertical axis, you have a relative wage rate, wage of skilled over unskilled in rate of change form. Okay, so this is simply a supply-demand model, but in rate of change form. And so this is the supply of relatively skilled workers in the U.S. from 1960 to 1980, exactly as I had shown you before. So that's at 3.8%. And this is what it is what it was from 1980 to 2005 at about 2%. That came from the previous material I gave you on those skill equivalent workers. Okay, and we also know. So these are the things that we know. Those are assumed exogenous here. Those we know. We also know that the rate of change of skilled to unskilled wages for the 60 to 80 period was slightly negative. And we also know that it was largely positive for the 80 to 2005 period. because we did this estimation, we know what the elasticity of substitution is, and we know what the slope of this line is, so we can fit a demand curve. The demand curve for the 60 to 80 period, people have to go to class. That's okay. You're all allowed to go to class. Okay.
Increase the supply.
What? Okay, everyone go to class, but the rest of you are going to hear the punchline. Not that you haven't heard it already. Okay. We'll take a break as everyone goes to class. Okay, so since we have the point here, which is the point at which supply and demand must go through, and we know the slope of the demand curve, we can draw that line, and we know that over here as well. And so what you can see here is exactly what I said before, that demand, relative demand, is increasing at a relatively high clip that's given by this intersection over here. But it's pretty constant over time. What's really wagging inequality around is the fact that the supply, which was growing at a very high rate, slows down and grows at a very low rate. Okay. Now, let me end by saying that I've largely omitted two potential important factors, labor unions and immigration. Let me deal with them quickly. Unions first. Most estimates of the impact of declining unionization on wage inequality show that about 10 to 20% of the increase for men and almost none for women can be explained by the lower strength of unions. That is to say, it is a contributing factor, but it's certainly nowhere a major factor. And I can go through the calculation of that. Mechanically, the impact of declining unions on the college wage premium can't be very large, since the union wage effect is about 15%, and unions decline from 33% of the non-agricultural workforce to about 12%. And that accounts for about 3 log points out of the total increase in the college wage premium of 23 log points. So that's not a lot. Now, the other factor is immigration. The ratio of college to high school workers increased at 3.8% from 1960 to 80, as we just saw, but at 2% from 1980 to 2005. So the question is, why isn't the sluggishness due to the fact that lots of immigrants came in and they're just less well-educated? Okay, so the question is, why isn't that the case? And the reason is that you can do a counterfactual. Had there been no immigration at all from 1980 to 2005, the college-high school supply would have increased by just 14% more. Most of the slowdown in college going was simply due to the native-born population. In addition, anyone who's studying immigration knows that immigrants are two types. There's very, very highly educated immigrants, and those mainly from Mexico who didn't have a chance to go beyond 6th grade or 8th grade. Okay. So immigration just isn't going to do it. I have a slide on it simply showing that just 14% of the decrease is due to immigrants. So, in conclusion, the future, what about the future? The bottom line is that the future of inequality depends on increasing the supply of educated workers. And this brings me to the end of my talk and a really big question for which I do not have a good answer yet, which is, why has educational attainment slowed? One important factor, but not a factor that can explain the whole thing, has been the high and increasing tuition in both the public and the private sectors in higher education. Another reason concerns the slowdown in secondary school graduation. So I'm pushing it back to high school. What's wrong with American high schools? And finally, the fact that many kids graduating from our high schools, once again, putting the onus on them, are simply not college ready. So as you saw today, there was a time not that long ago when America grew together, and widespread and rapidly increasing education played a major role. And the U.S. played an incredible role in the history of world education. Almost all countries in the world today copy what we did. And amazingly, we're sort of looking over our shoulder now at every single other OECD nation, or at least those that are in Europe. We're looking at Finland, we're looking at Norway. What are they? We're looking at Japan. What are they doing right? But from most of the 20th century, they looked at us. The U.S. made remarkable achievements in education. It led the way until recently. So how America can grow together again has much to do with advancing education and what I talked about concerning the race between education and technology. Thanks.
It's good to discuss education in general, I think, with higher education in the story, too, because what we do here is produce school. And it's always nice to understand it and maybe do it better than we do now. I want to be brief and let the audience have a crack at questions. So what I'll describe, among other things, are some aspects of education that I find interesting, ongoing research areas relevant to the topic we're doing today. And the underlying theme is something I learned a long time ago, that a few principles of thinking about policy issues go a long way. One is the concept of opportunity cost, that you can't do something without not doing something else with those resources. And there are also and the second one is that there are multiple ways to accomplish the same outcome, like reduce poverty. So the issue is really to pick among options. There are always options. And one of the interesting aspects of the book, Professor Goldin's book, is that education used to be a nice twofer. You moved up the income, you moved yourself up the income distribution, and the country grew faster, which benefited us all because we had a bigger pie to cut up. I don't worry too much about the distributional issues and what we're talking about, because you can always rectify what you don't like with tax policy. And you might say, well, gee, that's really hard, but I don't think it's any harder than other areas, to wit, healthcare. Some additional, but there are additional subtleties to think about. And if we go back to the OECD again and use them as their view, as a view of us from abroad, there's a recent report that cites as the big issues for the U.S. to worry about, here being infant mortality and why what we spend on education is comparatively much, but get comparatively poor educational outcomes, as measured by dropout rates, literacy rates, and risky behavior among youth, drugs and alcohol. It's also not clear, something that is emerging recently if you read certain macroeconomics, is that it's not clear that on a worldwide basis, education has all that much to do with countrywide growth compared to other things that are more cultural. Education is not going to help countries grow their way out of recessions as much as other things that economists have discovered. It's far less important, that's education, on an international scale than openness of trade, the rule of law, and religion. Confucianism being particularly good for growth, apparently. Tuition is also overemphasized to the point of making greater college attendance seem more of a straightforward policy issue than it is. The idea seems to be, if we just lower the direct or money costs of college, things fall into place very nicely. And it's up to an economist to point out that, or at least a labor economist, that the full cost of college is not only tuition, it's also the earning that you don't have because you're in class and have to study. For public higher education, the tuition-related expenses of direct costs of someplace like SUNY is about $8,000 a year, while the job you don't have is somewhere between $20,000 and $40,000 a year part-time versus full-time working in a factory, which is what I'd be doing if I didn't go on to college. So the point here is that the opportunity cost of foregone earnings, the job you don't have, is 2.5 to 5 times more important than tuition in the public higher education sector, which is about 80%. Right? The private sector is about 20%. And even though for a private university such as SU, the lost earnings are still either just as important if you're talking about a full-time job or 1.5 times more important than tuition net of discounts on average. So it's still 1.5, around as important or 1.5 times more important even in a private university. That's the foregone earnings part of the cost. Now, it's hard to get college administrators, I've tried this, to mention the opportunity cost dimension of paying for college. At this point, you want to insert mentally the deer in the headlights picture. Now, I think in part they do this because, college administrators, because what they want to do is increase college enrollments, and they don't want to diminish what they're doing to rein in tuition. So they want you to think that this is really important, and also I think they're also afraid that if you point out how expensive college really is, people won't go as much in general. My point, though, is that tuition-related policies will do less than you might think to increase college enrollments because it's not that big a fraction of the cost in 80% of the cases. At the sub-college level, there are subtle issues that are also starting to emerge as parts of our knowledge base and useful, perhaps, for decreasing the high school dropout rate, for example. What goes on inside the classroom, we have people that do education here, even in Maxwell, as well as in education of institutes. So I'm kind of, an amateur in this area. But what goes on inside the classroom, particularly who your classmates are in terms of being supportive and helpful versus disruptive, is crucial. In graduate school, it's pretty clear that students learn as much from each other as they do from the faculty. Sorry to have to reveal that dirty little secret, colleagues. So a policy lever to think about is how you promote cooperation among students. There are also interesting papers starting to emerge on the equal importance to educational outcomes of so-called soft skills or personality traits. I quoted a recent issue of the Journal of Human Resources on this. And soft skills turned out to be perhaps as important as hard skills being like math and science, English techniques. Soft skills may be just as important to labor market outcomes. Here we're talking about, can you get along with your coworkers? Do you give clear instructions? Is your style abrupt versus languidly soothing? And it's contextual also. The value of certain soft skills depends on the situation. Compare somebody who works at the returns desk of a department store versus a pilot. Right? If you're someone that takes the broken merchandise back, you want to say, "Oh, we're sorry, it doesn't work very well. It doesn't meet your needs. Can we do anything else for you?" The pilot, you're starting to crash. You don't want the pilot to be saying to the co-pilot, "Do you think you might consider pulling back on the controls so we don't crash? But if you don't want to, that's okay." No, pull it back. Right? You don't have time to be polite. And if we agree that soft skills are equally valuable to formal education, then the big issue becomes, are they investable? Can we alter them at less cost than more schooling for a given desirable outcome? Don't know yet. What I'm leading to is the following conclusion. Taxpayers want value for their money. What is so-called good government? That's what so-called good government means, and what's behind the accountability movement in education at all levels, the need to show what you've accomplished. Economists are sometimes criticized as knowing the price of everything and the value of nothing, usually by people who know the value of nothing and the price of nothing. Unfortunately, everything seems to have a price in terms of the opportunity cost sense. If something else not done, or more subtly, not done now versus has to be done later. Putting it off is the difference between heaven and earth. In heaven, there's freedom from want, and that means not only you have all the stuff you want, it's over like this. You get it all at the same time, because if you have to wait to use it, it's not freedom from want, and it's not pure heaven. Anyway, there are many ways to improve the lives of the less educated, the less advantaged, and more years of schooling is one relatively expensive way to do it, given the opportunity costs are hardly ever mentioned. Here at the number one policy school, we need to keep the pressure on folks in Washington, Albany, on Montgomery Street and East Washington Street to have goals for improving the situation of the less advantaged and achieve the given goals with programs that are quick rather than slow and as taxpayer-friendly as possible. The kind of thinking that's led to policy successes recently like microfinance, these little tiny loans, and economic development where there's an incredible bang for the many bucks. Creativity rules, but the principles that options are always exist and opportunities foregone cannot be avoided has to be kept in mind, always. So let me close by tying back into the issue of tuition costs as a worry for access to higher education, a topic that we've heard today and yesterday by Vice President Biden. Part of the accountability issue in higher education is rating us on how good we are. To an economist, the comparative ratings, such as U.S. News and World Report, are strange because they rate universities on inputs. The places with the most inputs get more highly rated. Places with big endowments, good faculty-student ratios, high SATs, get rated highly. But these are inputs into the education process. What we do is better would be to rate universities based on how well they perform given their input base. How much value do they add? Who gets the most for the student out of what they start with? This means basing accountability on outcomes, which might include the improvement in knowledge or economic situation. Time for a little self-backpatting. When I came here to SU 10 years ago, I was immediately taken with how much SU does with so little. How well we do compared to Harvard, sorry, Claudia, with an endowment that's about 3 to 5% of Harvard's. The customers would be better shoppers in the higher education market if they had more information about which places have better grounds to charge them the tuition they do because they minimize waste. And there are ratings of business schools, for example, now that rate them on how much value they add to the student because it's just a basic fact of life that HBS starts with a very different set of inputs and situation than the Whitman School does. My son goes to a private school in DeWitt where my wife's been a trustee, and one of their unstated mottos, or at least not publicly stated mottos, is, "We won't piss away your money." And a way to rein in tuition inflation that the vice president noted now exceeds that of health care is to make universities justify how much they charge by evaluating them or making them accountable on how well they do with their raw materials. Thank you, and now for some questions from our raw materials.
I just want to say a couple of things about Tom's very good comments. Tuition, I agree with you, is potentially overrated, but the problem isn't so much tuition as it is the capital market, it's the credit market. So it is true that tuition isn't that high relative to the opportunity cost. And in fact, you can go nearby and not have to, residential costs are expensive. But there are experiments. So there's one in West Virginia, for example. So West Virginia, which, as you might imagine, has one of the lowest college graduation rates in the nation, decided to figure out why this was the case. And the potential answer was that it was a capital market problem, that students were working while they were in school. And even though they weren't earning a tremendous amount, they were inhibiting their ability to graduate on time. And so we all know that there's no longer a 4-year BA degree in America there. And the more you stretch it out, the more probability the person is going to fall off track and leave. So they had fellowships that encompassed a very large fraction of West Virginia high school students. if you went to school, you had to go to school in West Virginia, but we know that people go close by, and they figured out that by making certain that if the person got the fellowship, got the scholarship, they had to show that they were taking the set of courses, that they really got people through. So it was, the tuition matters through the fact that there are these capital market constraints, and these kids therefore weren't working. They were spending more time. So I absolutely agree with you that there's a bit too much emphasis on tuition. On the other hand, there's too little emphasis on capital markets. The other thing is that the soft skills issue is incredibly important. Larry and David Otter and Melissa Kearney have written on, and Larry and I in our book continue this, on what has happened more recently since the 1990s, the sort of polarization of the wage structure. That what's really caving in is those who have some college, who have 2-year degrees, who have some skills, but their skills can be sent off. Okay, they can be easily replicated. You can write an algorithm to do what this person does. You cannot write an algorithm for the soft skills. And so people who have, and you can't write an algorithm for the people who are the truly brilliant creative minds, and you can't write an algorithm for the person who's dusting your computer, okay, or the person who's cutting your hair. So yes, the soft skills matter a tremendous amount. Okay, questions?
Yeah, I got one more thing to say.
Yeah.
Where I'm headed with the issue of tuition is that I don't have a problem with the notion of a capital market, but I want to hear somebody out there at any level of government or higher administration say, then we got to start lending people more than tuition. We got to do something to take care of the fact that there's this other huge cost, and it slows you down, and tuition just says we got to do better at loaning people or doing something to subsidize the opportunity cost part of it.
Yeah, and it should sort of pay off. These people should graduate. They should get that.
Yeah, and there are countries like Australia where they condition on how well you do after school.
Right, that's right. Yeah.
So I have 2 questions. One is, you've been sort of showing us data in terms of wage premium on college education. So it was the ratio of college versus high school. And in the U.S., since there are so many people who just get postgraduate degrees,
Being given up.
the increase in people who pursue postgraduate degrees seems to be a recent trend. I don't know when this sort of started, but just clearly the U.S. is the pioneer in that trend. So I just wanted to ask you whether you have any sort of figures on the wage premium, the rise in wage premium on education that's just being driven from more people just going on to not just college, but beyond that.
That's a very good question. Let me answer it in 2 parts.
Okay, let me just ask you my second question. So you basically explained the rising inequality in the U.S. in terms of the slowdown in educational investment, and you just said that there were 2 components. One was, sort of slowdown in sort of people pursuing college, and the other thing that you pointed out, which was very interesting, was low graduation rates from high school. So you sort of hinted that somehow there was just the population who were college ready somehow wasn't just growing as fast enough just compared to the earlier period. And here I was just thinking, of course you just hinted that there are other things like union power or even sort of wage setting sort of institutions that are important in shaping the overall picture. Because in Europe, just compared to the U.S., fewer people go into the university. But in terms of wage inequality, that didn't really lead to the rise in wage inequality in Europe. But just perhaps the difference between the U.S. story is that maybe it was the investment in sort of primary and secondary education that affected, in a sense, the supply of college-ready people. So since you haven't really talked about what's going on in the U.S. In terms of investment in primary and secondary education, and I'm sort of interested in knowing whether in the earlier periods when the wage, when inequality was reducing, sort of relative to investments in higher education, maybe there was more sort of investment in primary and secondary education.
Okay, lots of different questions. Let me see if I can handle them, and if I don't, others can ask the same question. Okay, the first one, I don't have a readily available statistic on what would be the returns to 16 plus, okay? And what I want to include in 16 plus, because there's a huge number of masters, particularly, for example, masters in education, that have an immediate return, not because anything is given in these programs, but because school boards give you an automatic increase with that, which is a whole other set of issues. The relationship between other countries, there are always these problems in measurement, which is why the people who work in the OECD in their education division, in my mind, are saints or magicians, because there are such still large differences, as you well know, across countries. So there are many nations in which you go to high school for 13 years, and then you go to college, and your college degree is your first professional degree. And so how do I then make comparisons, since lawyers are coming out after what we would call a BA, but it's not a BA, it's their first professional degree. So it makes it a little bit more difficult. But this is an extremely important issue to look at, and one that I'm sorry I don't have precise data on in the U.S. If we break this out, I do know what it looks like for certain 16 plus, such as MBAs and MDs and so on, and of course that's sort of astronomical. Now, your point about let me move to the point that you sort of ended with, which is why just stop? If I could rephrase your question is why just stop at saying, look, high school graduation rates have reached a plateau since around 1970. It looks like something's wrong. College graduation rates, which have now started to rise, are, in many ways, they're being determined by what's going on at the high school level. And your point is, no. Look, everything that's going on at the high school level is being determined by what's happening before. There's absolutely no question about that. And that's where I think the most important work now is being done on trying to understand why we've hit this plateau in high school. And a lot of it is sort of unraveling back into preschool and into rising inequality has further implications for poverty and for children, and disproportionate number of children growing up in poverty, because the poor have more kids than the rich. They're growing up in single-parent families. They're growing up in households where fewer words are spoken every day, fewer books are read, and so on and so forth. So I think that that's really where the best work is being done. In terms of actual money being spent per child in the U.S., that just is not where it is. I mean, we just spend enormous amounts on elementary education. Yes, there are, difficult differences across districts, but I don't think that that's where the action is going to be. Yeah.
So your main argument seems to be that changes in educational attainment are the principal cause of inequality. But your remarks just from a second ago...
Of changing inequality.
Changing inequality.
Yeah.
Your remarks from a second ago suggest that it's also true that changing inequality
that's right.
is a principal contributor to educational attainment. How do you untangle that? It doesn't sound like your work untangles.
Yeah, no, I didn't say it was a principal contributor. I said that is a research agenda that I think would be important to follow. That's right.
Does your book address that simultaneity and try and untangle that?
No, the book is mainly concerned with everything that I gave you, which is 100 years of history, and another volume, possibly written by someone in this audience, can then say what we really need to do is to say in 1990 we had 10 years of rising inequality. We have changes in fertility by parental education and income. How does this feed back? Yeah.
I'd also like to point out that comparisons of spending per pupil are very troubling, not only across districts but across countries. The enormous inequality in the United States, which far exceeds the other countries, leads to problems of lack of preparation and to problems of mobility among low populations and problem of parental supervision that raise the cost of education to get the same performance out. So you really can't compare the spending per pupil across countries in a meaningful way.
Say this again. So rather than doing it across states, you're talking about across countries.
We have much more inequality in this country than other countries.
Yeah.
And that means that to get the same level of performance out of students, we have many additional healthcare expenses.
In fact, one of the fascinating findings is that in a recent OECD study is that Massachusetts and Minnesota, so if you divide the U.S. into states, which we are divided into, that, and this doesn't have to do with expenditures, it has to do with value added, that Massachusetts and Minnesota do just about as well as Finland and Norway in most educational performance indicators. Yeah, exactly. But still, when we pump more bucks into school districts, we're not getting a lot out of it, and we have to ask, what are the organizational differences? And this is, a giant topic.
Yeah, I mean, you just sat there and said you pump more bucks into it. I'm not saying you shouldn't spend money on education. Anyway, I was wondering if you looked at cultural aspects specifically, because that doesn't just address lower socioeconomic issues, that actually addresses everybody across the board, at least from my observation. The cultural influences such as the corrupting influence of third generation effect. Specifically, you can look at a contemporary example. It was actually a documentary done called 2 Million Minutes. It was actually done by a venture capitalist in both China and India, and he observed his workers in China and India. They're very, sharp, industrious, and he was worried about his daughters because they're going to have to compete against these people. And what he found in 2 million minutes is roughly how many minutes you have in, say, high school, that Chinese and Indians put culturally a higher emphasis on education, specifically skill sets indicative of current and supplanted K-way, leading sectors of current supplanted K-way, science, technology, engineering, mathematics. I had B, business, STEM B. If you looked at that, I go down the street whenever I walk home, and I see like a lot of American students. They're drinking, they're partying every day. So you pump more bucks, and they're here, but they really don't earn anything. They're really not learning anything. They pull like a 1-2. I see Asian kids; they got their head buried in the books. So have you looked at any cultural contributing factors?
So, as I said, I presented to you what's in the book. This is a next project, okay? This book is not pulling apart different societies or different parts of America, okay? This is an agenda about asking about education today. I don't disagree with you. It's just not what this book has been about, okay? Now, it is true. What's the matter? You're shaking your head.
Well, no, you're saying that you just said that if you pump more bucks into schools and you don't get enough bang for your buck. What I'm saying is maybe that might be a contributing component to why you're not getting a bang for your buck.
Okay, well, that's a very, very good point, okay? But it's not something that I have not worked. I'm not going to speak ex cathedra about stuff that I have not worked on. I have not worked on different cultures and how they respond to different amounts of resources that are being poured into. I know exactly what you're talking about,
Okay.
but it's not something that I have personally worked on. We know in America today, we know which cultural groups do better. We know that they do better independent of the amount of money that's being poured into their schools. I couldn't disagree. I couldn't agree with you more about this. I do not disagree with you at all.
I wasn't dealing
Okay.
with the book. I just dealt
Yeah.
with that one comment that you had mentioned, that we put more money into schools, we're not getting a bang for more bang.
Well, that's what it looks like. That's what research. I am just citing research.
That factor, that's all.
No. Yeah.
Could you comment on the point that Tom raised as to the implications for modeling returns on investment, this notion of the foregone opportunity? Because it seems to me that it's very real. People do lose income when they go to college.
I'm sorry?
Well, people lose income when they go to college if
That's
they
right.
already have a job. That's the foregone opportunity he was talking
Right.
about, right? How do you model that, and does it add tremendous complexity to what you're trying
No,
to
I
do
mean,
in your work? How would you
that's
actually
sort
do
of
that?
implicit in the rate of return calculation.
But don't you need to make it explicit to
Well, it is.
demonstrate the impact of what he raised? I'm just
Yeah,
trying-
no, I mean, he knows that when we do these calculations, it's sort of relative to what you would have earned. And so the only issue here is whether you're getting the right person on the margin. Okay, it is in some ways sort of explicit
Okay.
in the model. Right? Yeah.
You emphasize the effect of changes in supply of education over technological change in the marketplace, especially with that diagram where you show the elasticity substitution effects. And I was just wondering how much that's influenced by your assumption of the same elasticity of substitution
Right.
in those two periods. And I wonder
Right.
if you've done anything
Yeah.
to see whether that assumption is correct by disaggregating or some other.
Yeah, and the answer is yes. So you just don't get large changes in the elasticity of substitution. We also break it down into, since the early period, you really want to look at the high school, not high school differential. So we also break it into that as well.
And,
Yeah.
and you find there, too, essentially the same
Well, no,
elasticity?
we find for that gets a little more complicated. For that, we do find a change in the elasticity of substitution, but that becomes sort of complicated concerning the fact that high school graduates and high school dropouts are far better substitutes
That's
today
right. I was-
than they were in the past.
Yeah, I was
Exactly.
going to point out the earnings
That's right.
differential is very little to
That's
inflation.
exactly
and,
right.
And that might be a factor underlying some of the other issues we spoke about in terms of failure.
But the college differential results are very robust across the century. But for obvious reasons, the high school graduate who used to be, a more elite individual is sort of less so in the more recent period. Yeah, that's right. And that's taken up in Chapter 8 of the book. Yeah.
This is just on if the main thing that we're trying to do here is increase enrollment in universities or completing education, and we think that the major barrier, or at least one barrier, is tuition or opportunity costs, and we know that the rate of return to schooling does in fact compensate you for the opportunity costs, so it's a good investment in the end. But you mentioned credit constraints as one reason why you wouldn't make this investment.
Or you make it and you're working at the same time and you're putting your education then at peril.
Well, I think it's a moral hazard problem because if I come out of medical school, I can borrow up the wazoo immediately, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
But if I'm in medical school, I can't because I think they worry you're not going to finish. You're going to,
You will party too much.
go to Canada with the money and spend it on,
Right. I guess my point is just that it does to me, the credit constraints, in terms of making it possible for you to go, in general, they don't seem to materialize that much for people. You can borrow lots and lots of money because people you want to borrow money from, in fact, know it's a good investment. So it doesn't seem like the credit constraint issue seems real to me. So it seems like it has to be something else that stops you from going if it's this opportunity cost. I don't really have a good idea for what it is. Discount rates, maybe, but that sounds too Crutch-like. Anyway, that's mine.
So you may know more about going out and borrowing a lot of money to go to college, but I don't think it is that easy to go out and borrow a tremendous amount. You have no collateral. You can, as Tom just said, you can skip town. You can default on. There's a tremendous loan default.
And very short repayment periods.
And very short. That's a good point. Thank you.
Well, so then those are if that's true, and I believe you. I mean,
yeah.
I haven't borrowed that much money, frankly. But,
He's from Canada, where they pay everything.
I'm sorry?
He's from Canada, where they pay for everything.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
We don't want to talk about that.
They're honest. And
people really aren't credit constrained in Canada for education. But if those things are true, then the weird question is, why does the credit market impose those constraints? If we do know from all this data that the investment in education is good.
Because there are all these problems and selectivity problems and all the problems that Tom just talked about. Okay. So they're big risks. Okay. Okay. The problem is the 14th Amendment. Okay, that's the problem. End of story.
You also can't borrow against pension funds either.
You can't borrow against your labor.
Yeah.
We have no debtor's prison.
Yeah.
We don't have slavery. Okay, we don't.
I'd like to thank
Okay.